Welcome back to Illumine. This time we're going to look at the modern responses to the issue of the calendar and the theological issues that arise from it, harking back to the questions that arise for us in the causerie and the credibility of the Jewish faith on the basis of the calendar and the biblical account. And we're going to do so in the American context. And we're going to do so in the American context using the writings of one of the founders and key theologians of the Reform movement, Rabbi Kauffman Kohler. Rabbi Kauffman Kohler was born in Germany to a rabbinic family and studied in Germany, among others also in Frankfurt am Main with Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch. He came to America and was called to rabbinic service in Detroit, in Congregation Beth El. He served Congregation Sinai in Chicago, then to follow the footsteps of his father-in-law, also one of the founders of the Reform movement, in Congregation Beth El in New York, before being elected to the presidency of Hebrew Union College in 1903, one of the framers and the founders of the Pittsburgh platform of the Reform movement in 1885. Already as a rabbi in Congregation Sinai in Chicago, Kauffman Kohler launched Sunday lectures and Sunday learning for his congregants. In a sermon that Kauffman Kohler delivered more than once, and that was published in the 1880s, Kohler argues for Sunday lectures and Sunday learning for Sunday gatherings of Jews on the basis of practical considerations. For Kohler, the issue is not one of theology or of science. Rather, it is a practical question that he seeks to respond to. Jews cannot come to their congregations on the Sabbath. They cannot come for prayer and for learning on the Sabbath because they're working, because they care for themselves and for their families. And the question that arises for the rabbi is, are we going to allow these Jews to starve for Jewish learning, to not have access to Jewish learning, to Jewish community, to Jewish gathering, and to spiritual elevation? Or are we going to guarantee their spiritual survival, their education, by offering them opportunities to gather on a Sunday? That is the primary question that Kauffman Kohler seeks to address. Towards the end of Kauffman Kohler's argument, Kauffman Kohler does turn to the issue of the credibility of the calendar and the credibility of our structure of the week. And in this context, he says, "Most assuredly, you cannot believe that God has a Sabbath day. You can no longer make even your children at school believe that God began the work of creation on Sunday and finished it on Friday to rest on Saturday. Beyond our little planet, there are no days such as we have. Man created days in counting the revolutions of the earth, and months and weeks in counting the turns of the moon." Here we see a diversion from the traditional causerie argument with regard to the credibility of the calendar, the credibility of the Jewish week, into an understanding that the Jewish week, the calendar, the counting are human created, are human products, are cultural products, and other products of convention rather than creation and revelation. What, therefore, is the value of the Sabbath? Why, then, do we celebrate the Sabbath? According to Kauffman Kohler, in adopting it, the Jewish religion rendered it a fundamental law for the people, a day of rest and recreation devoted to man's higher interests. Henceforth, the Jewish Sabbath became the greatest teacher and benefactor of man. It took the yoke of slavery from his neck, declaring all to be free and alike before God. In other words, for Kauffman Kohler, the ideal of the Sabbath, the religious value of the Sabbath, the religious value of that moment of the calendar relates to its liberation, and we are back to that liberation from slavery that we had been discussing earlier on in our studies. For Kauffman Kohler, the issue is not of truth, of science, but rather of the religious value, of the value of humanity, of freedom, of liberation, and of the ability to pursue man's higher interests in the context of the Sabbath. In the modern era, we have been struggling in our reading, in our interpretation, and in our understanding of the calendar in a literal way, attempting to render coherent so many different sources of text and of science and of archaeology and of so much of our material culture. At the same time, we are attached to this calendar, we are attached to our liturgies, and we are attached to a sense of narrative and to a sense of identity that is associated with our religious faith. Kauffman Kohler represents a reform response to that struggle. Kauffman Kohler regards all of the textual evidence, looks at the scientific evidence, look at the evidence from scholarship. He takes all of this evidence together and he comes to the conclusion that we can no longer read the biblical text literally. We can no longer render its sources coherent and offer a credible account of the calendar or of the days of the week. Nevertheless, he insists on the value of the Jewish calendar. He insists on the value of the Sabbath, and he insists on our need to educate Jews and to bring Jews together for the sake of Jewish learning, for the sake of the congregation, and for the sake of spiritual elevation. This, in a sense, is the segue to what will become our contemporary conversation about the meaning and implications of the Jewish calendar today.